Again, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. The title of this talk is Programming Lessons from Japanese Poetry. And there are many Japanese poetic forms. In this specific talk, I'll be discussing about one of the Japanese poetic forms known as haiku. So before I start this talk, I would like to request us to raise our hands if we are already familiar with haiku. So looks like about 7, 8 of us, about half of us are actually familiar with haiku. That's great, thank you. And those of us who are not familiar, there's nothing to worry about. We'll discuss it as we move along. And in this specific talk, I'll be sharing some works of Japanese haiku masters. I personally am not familiar with Japanese language, so the works I'll be sharing will be in English. And first, I'd like to apologize in advance in case the English version of the haiku do not do justice to the original Japanese version, because something always gets lost in translation. And before I start this talk, I'd like to share a little bit of a personal story on how I got inspired to explore this specific topic. So, in 2023, I happened to come across this book, which consisted of poems written by Zen monks and haiku poets on the verge of death. I immensely enjoyed this book, and I got introduced to haiku through this book. Few months later, I joined one group known as Haiku Northwest, based in Washington, USA. I attended one of their virtual meetings, and through that meeting, I got an opportunity to learn more about haiku, and also got inspired to explore even more. Few months later, I attended a conference or a retreat known as Civic Haiku Getaway. So it is similar to PyCon, but targeted towards haiku. So through that conference, I got an opportunity to learn a little bit more about haiku, and I got inspired to explore even more. And in winter that year, I spent most of my spare time staying indoors, because in Pacific Northwest, it is cold and it is gray. And most of my spare time was spent reading and exploring haiku. And my background is software engineering, so that's why I thought it would be interesting to explore parallels between haiku practice and computer programming. So what is haiku then? The old pond, a frog jumps in, sound of water, Matsuo Baso. In this poem, the poet creates a scene of an old pond, a specific pond. And we could implicitly assume that the pond is quiet, there's no sound there, there's stillness and there's silence there. A frog suddenly jumps in and creates a splash type of sound or a disruption. Evening wind, water laps the heron's legs, Shiva Bhusal. A world of dew, and within every dewdrop, a world of struggle, Kobayashi Isa. So we looked at 3 haiku poems by 3 great Japanese haiku masters. So what are the attributes in these poems that make them haiku? So the first attribute is focus on a specific moment For example, in the first poem, the poet is focusing on a specific moment when the frog jumps into the pond and creates a splash sound. And generally, haiku consists of two-part structure. So we call it juxtaposition. And so in the first poem, the still pond could be one part, and frog jumping in and creating a splash could be the second part. And then the third part is the season word. So haiku typically consists of a season word, and in the first poem that we looked at, frog is generally considered a season word for spring. And the fourth is kirezi, which is specific to Japanese language. So there are specific words or sounds that signify a cut, and that is known as kirezi. But the same thing is achieved in English language haiku through punctuation, through white spaces. And other attributes are haiku are generally short, and most importantly, they contain only the things that are needed. And generally, haiku use simple language, everyday images that poets see, that is in haiku. And the third part is that haiku is generally objective, which means poets share things what they see, and they do not impose their bias or their opinion in the poems that they share. And the attributes that I shared earlier, those are not something that have to be in a haiku. One prominent haiku poet, Michael Dylan Wells, calls this sort of things haiku targets. So those are something that we look at and that the poet looks at and sees. If that attribute could be added to a haiku, and if it improves the quality of the haiku, then it's good to add that. But if it doesn't strengthen the haiku, then it's not required to add that attribute. And in Japanese, traditionally, it's written in 575 syllable format, but in modern English haiku, poets do not use 575 syllable pattern. And I have heard some of the haiku groups in Japan as well, they do not strictly adhere to 575 pattern. And this is a software engineering conference, so and specifically Python conference. And next, we'll be exploring how GN of Python is actually in synergy with haiku poetics. So GN of Python, it consists of 20 aphorisms, and if you count it, there are only 19 there. So the 20th aphorism is an empty one, or that is yet to be written. So in general, this is a poetry in itself as well. And all these aphorisms, what all these aphorisms tell us is how to write clean, elegant, maintainable Python code, or how to write Pythonic code. And next, we'll be discussing a few of the aphorisms which actually align with haiku poetics. So the first aphorism is, simple is better than complex. The summer river, although there is a breeze, my horse goes through the water. Masaoka Shiki. This is a classic example of simplicity in poetry. And in code 2, we may want to make our code 2 as simple as some of the haiku poems. So there are these two versions. First one is needlessly complex, and second one is simple, because in the second one we're using conventional choice, not the not the clever choice. And then in general, second one is simple, so second one is preferred over the first one. And this was also mentioned by one of our keynote speakers last evening, that coming up with a simple solution to a complex software engineering problem is not an easy thing. So simple isn't necessarily equivalent to being easy. Actually, it's the opposite thing. Coming up with a simple solution is often a hard task. And the next aphorism is sparse is better than dense. So in haiku, sparsity is achieved through kirezi. This allows the reader to breathe and pause and then move to the next fragment. So the sparsity in code is achieved through white spaces. So this allows the reader to breathe and then understand the code better. And this is an example in which the first version of all the versions of the code are doing the same thing. The first version is the most sparse, and the last version is the most dense. And as the density of the code increases, we see that the readability of the code decreases, and it's hard to debug the code as well. So sparsity in this specific example is a good virtue to have. The third aphorism is beautiful is better than ugly. So in haiku, beauty is something that we see in the natural world, or humans' interaction with the natural world. And not just the perfection and the orderliness of nature, but also the imperfection and the chaos of nature. And beauty is also seen in impermanence of things. Cherry blossoms is a classic example of it. So this can be considered something like a bittersweet moment of pleasure. We find pleasure in things with also the realization that they're not gonna last forever. And the concept of beauty is slightly different in case of code. So to me, a code is a beautiful code if it's readable, if it's consistent in style, if it's concise, and if it's maintainable. So in this example, the first one could be an ugly version of doing the same thing, and second one is a more beautiful version. The second one allows us to breathe, and second one also has better naming convention. It's more readable, and then in general, it's more maintainable as well. So those sort of attributes make the second version of the code beautiful than the first one. And another aphorism is readability counts. So in haiku, readability is achieved through using everyday words, everyday things, the things that we see in everyday world. And in case of code, readability could be achieved by using standard approaches of solving a problem. And then also making the code sparse, and that is also one part, basically. And in this specific example, both the codes are doing the same thing, but the second version is more readable than the first one. And next aphorism is, now is better than never. So haiku poets, when they come up with first draft of a poem in their mind, they roll it in their head for a long time. They essentially refactor the poetry in their head, and then they also write it on the paper and revise it multiple times. And then sometimes they might also show it to their haiku study group and receive feedback from them. And then when they send the poem to the editor too might make some small edits before publishing it. So from conceiving the idea to the production of haiku, there is a series of steps that goes through. Same is with chord as well. When we write the first, same is with chord as well. When we write the first draft of the code, it goes through several series of refactorings. It also goes through several series of code reviews until it gets merged to the master. So process-wise, both the things are somewhat similar. But this aphorism is not focusing on the middle steps from the first draft to the production-ready draft. It's actually focusing on the first draft itself. So this aphorism tells us to do quick prototyping if we have an idea in our mind and just get started with the work. Just get started with the work. But this comes with a condition. Although never is better than often, right now. So not every thoughts that come to someone's mind deserve to be penned down as haiku. Same is with code as well. Not every feature deserves implementation. And this thing was also emphasized by our keynote speaker last evening. So some of the features, they deserve to be weighted, and some of the features, they deserve to be ignored altogether. So far we discussed the aphorisms that actually align with haiku poetics. Next, we'll be discussing about one of the aphorisms which actually contradict with haiku poetics. So it is explicit is better than implicit. So in this specific code version, in the second in the explicit way, we are explicitly telling the compiler to open the file in read mode and with UTF-8 encoding. In the first version, we are letting the compiler decide on what mode and what encoding that it should open the file. So the second version is always preferred over the first one because of two reasons. So the first reason is the second version is more readable. By looking at the code itself, we know what is going on. And then second version also avoids unexpected compiler or interpreter surprises. And so in general, being explicit is a positive, being explicit is always considered positive in programming. But this might not be the case in haiku. A crow caws, I also am alone, Santoka Taneda. So just looking at this poem, just looking at this English translation of the poem, we do not know who is saying, I also am alone. It could be the poet looking at the crow and saying, hey crow, you are not the only person who is alone. I too am alone. Or it could also be the crow who actually sees the poet and says, and by cawing says, hey poet, not just you, but I also am alone. But most of the readers who have read Santoka Taneda, they implicitly understand that it's actually the poet who is saying, I also am alone, although the poet is not explicit here. So letting the reader figure out the meaning themselves, implicitly, it's considered a virtue in case of haiku. So far we discussed about the different aphorisms in GN of Python and how they are similar with haiku poetics and how one of the aphorisms contradicts with haiku poetics. Next, we'll be discussing the general software engineering lessons that we could actually import from haiku. So the first lesson is that of awareness. So the poems which works I shared in this talk, all the poets, they had this ability to notice things around them that we commonly fail to notice. They had a heightened sense of awareness. And by awareness in software engineering context, I would consider it as being aware of our own weakness, strength, and limitations when we use code, and then in general when we try to solve a software engineering problem. And not just our own weakness, strength, and limitations, but also the weakness, strength, and limitations of other individuals. And this helps to make the working environment more inclusive and more collaborative. And next lesson is that of communication. So haiku teaches us that the most effective form of communication is the simplest. And by form of communication, I am not just referring to natural language communication. I'm also referring to communication through code. Because when we are writing the code, we are not just telling the computer to do something, we're also telling another human being what we are telling the computer to do. And next lesson that we could learn from haiku is embracing imperfection. So none of the software engineering systems are ideal or perfect. And also, when we make design decisions, it's often hard to find a perfect solution. We always have to compromise on one or two things. And haiku teaches us to actually acknowledge trade-offs, or to actually embrace imperfection in general in the system and also in design decisions. And then a software system, since it is not perfect, it's always a work in progress. So continuous iterative development is required. And next lesson that we could learn from haiku is that of minimalism. Minimalism doesn't necessarily mean being short. So it means keeping only the things that are needed. So that is something that we could implement in software systems as well. And lastly, I would like to share that. I feel haiku is actually Python's literary sibling in poetry. And as much as poets find pleasure in writing poetry, may we all too find pleasure in the process itself of writing the code. With this, I would like to end this talk. Thank you so much for being such a wonderful audience.
Thank you so much for your presentation. If anyone has any questions, you may ask. Anyone?
It's not a question so much as, could you share a haiku that you've written with us?
Thank you. Let me think and then share. Yeah. No worries. So I'll share one haiku written maybe last year. So, tatami floor, the tea master bows to a toddler. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentations.